Hallå! Välkomna till Jesusfolket. Vi tror på Gud, det har ni säkert märkt. Och när jag träffar ateister, folk som inte tror på Gud, så säger de ofta att det finns inga bevis för att tro på Gud. Att de tror på fakta och sådant som är beviserat, om det heter så. Medan vi tror på sånt som inte kan bevisas. Och det stämmer inte. I tusentals år har teologer och kristna filosofer talat om olika gudsbevis. Och jag har, som ni kanske minns, undervisat en spiritual Q&A-klass i Kettering i Storbritannien, där jag har befunnit mig under hösten. Vi släppte poddavsnitt för ett tag sedan om varför Gud inte beordrade folkmord i Gamla testamentet. Och det var från en sådan klass. Och i det här specialpoddavsnittet så har jag samlat 4 olika föreläsningar som sammanlagt har 7 olika argument för Guds existens i sig. Oavsett om du redan tror på Gud eller är skeptisk eller inte vet vad du tror, så hoppas jag att det kan vara till nytta för dig. Eftersom britter talar engelska så är föreläsningar på engelska. Men jag hoppas att ni förstår det språket. Håll till godo. So, cosmological arguments for God's existence depart from the existence of the universe, or the origin of the universe. So all the things around us, not just on this planet, but all the stars and other planets and everything else in space, that's what the universe refers to. It refers to everything around us. And basically these arguments point to the existence of a creator, of an origin of the universe. I'm gonna tilt this so I look better in the YouTube video. Anyways, so I want to present 2 cosmological arguments, which are among the most common ones. And so the first is called the Kalam argument. And as I just said, it comes from Islam originally. It has been popularized just the last 30 years or so by a Christian philosopher called William Lane Craig, an American, who is quite influential. He has a website called Reasonable Faith, and he got podcasts and YouTube videos and stuff. And I find him very, very good. And so he wrote a book about the Kalam cosmological argument, and he has done a lot in defending it, but other Christians have also defended it, and Muslims and other God believers. Obviously, atheists have been trying to argue against it, but still it is one of the most popular arguments. It's one of the most widely discussed arguments. And the thing is, it's quite simple. So it isn't, a list of 20 premises, which is basically starting points in an argument. It's just 2 premises, and then number 3 is conclusion. And in this type of argument, if both premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. It's logically necessary that the conclusion is true. And the argument goes as follows. The first premise says everything that begins to exist has a cause. The second premise, the universe began to exist, and so the conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. So pretty straightforward. If it's true that everything that pops into existence has a cause, there's a reason behind why that thing started to exist, and if it's true that the universe began to exist, then it has to be true that the universe has a cause. All right? And then from that, we can conclude that if it's true that the universe has a cause, this cause has to be immaterial. So the cause is immaterial, meaning it doesn't consist of matter. Why is that? Because all matter there is inside the universe, per definition. Likewise, it has to be timeless. Because see, according to the most popular scientific theory about the origin of the universe, the Big Bang theory, not only did space origin with the origin of the universe, but time itself. Time began when the universe began. And since space also originated there, this cause needs to be spaceless. But of course, since the universe is a pretty big thing, and consists of many different types of things and different types of phenomena, you have to conclude that the cause is quite powerful as well. So it wasn't just a little chicken originating in the Big Bang, but literally everything that we see around us. And this does sound like God. In fact, most atheists try to avoid this conclusion because they realize if we say that the universe has a cause, it's quite evident that this cause needs to be immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and very, very powerful, which is what we mean by God. But then the question, of course, is, are these premises true? Can we reach this conclusion? Is it true that everything that begins to exist has a cause and that the universe began to exist? And I think it's extremely likely that these are true. In fact, I think it's very evident. But I want to defend these two premises. If we start with the first one, everything that begins to exist has a cause, is basically saying the same thing as nothing comes into existence out of nothing by nothing. So basically, if you have nothing at all, you won't see Shakespeare pop up, for no reason from that. You won't see a, fridge or a bazooka or anything just pop out into existence from nothing. If you first have nothing and then something pops into existence, that requires a cause which could very well be immaterial. And again, it's probable that if God exists, he can do that. But if you remove God as well and you have no God, no universe, nothing at all, then it's literally impossible that anything originates. Now, there are some atheists that have tried to argue against this. One atheist, what's the English word for physicist? Is that the word? Yeah, he's not a physician because he's not a doctor. He's into physics. Yeah. So he has written a book called A Universe from Nothing, where he tries to explain why the universe came into existence from nothing. However, he does a mistake, and that is that he calls something nothing. He tries to show how in the empty vacuum, there's still a little bit of vacuum energy, which according to quantum physics can spawn particles into existence. That's Lawrence Krauss. And physicists have observed this, that on a very, very tiny level, the quantum level, particles pop into existence seemingly from nothing, although they do pop into existence due to energy fluctuating. Basically, what it does then is assuming that the laws of nature and that energy and matter exist, but he calls that nothing because it's basically as close to nothing as we get. Though philosophically, that's a mistake because he's talking about something. He's talking about vacuum energy and he's talking about quantum particles and quantum physics, and that's still not nothing. If you really talk about nothing, then there obviously are no mechanisms for nothing to produce or cause anything. There are no properties that nothing can use. Nothing is just nothing. It's the absence of anything. And so this statement that everything that begins to exist has a cause is, I think, very, very evident. If I show you this jar of chutney and say that it popped into existence from nothing by nothing and there's no reason for it being here, and here it is and it tastes nice, you would assume that I was lying. and that's very logical of you to do, because it's evident that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, how about the second premise, that the universe began to exist? There have been people in history who have thought that the universe is eternal. In fact, that was quite popular among atheists in the 19th century. And what many don't know is that the man who came up with the Big Bang Theory was a priest. He was a Catholic priest. And so he was accused of inventing this theory as evidence for God, because obviously in the Bible it says that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that God created the universe, and so that there was a time when the universe wasn't, and then the universe came into being. But today the Big Bang Theory is the dominant theory, based on different kind of evidences. You have seen that the universe is expanding, and obviously if it's getting bigger, if you then wind back time, you will see that it gets smaller and smaller until there comes what physicists call a singularity, where all of the universe, all of matter that's in the universe were collected in a tiny, tiny little blob, and that's the beginning of the universe. And there's other kinds of evidences as well, but there are also philosophical arguments for why the universe cannot have been eternal in the past. And that's because an infinite amount of events in the past is really not possible. So it is possible to imagine, for example, heaven, where there will be a day one, where we go into heaven, and then we'll have eternal life, so then will come day 1 million and 1 trillion and so on, and it will go on for infinity. It's a whole other thing to talk about an infinite past. And you can see that quite clearly by some thought experiments. So say, for example, that not just the universe, but our solar system has existed for infinity. Obviously it hasn't, but let's say that's so. And let's say that while Jupiter does 1 lap around the sun, the Earth does 2. All right. So the Earth is doing twice as many turns around the sun as Jupiter. Now, if our solar system has existed for eternity past, then the Earth and Jupiter has done the exactly same amount of laps around the sun, an infinite amount, right? But the Earth still has done twice as many. And if you are thinking that doesn't make sense, that's precisely right. There's a mathematician called, or there was a mathematician called Hilbert, who talked about a hotel to illustrate how an actual infinite cannot exist. So he said that in this hotel there are an infinite amount of rooms. And let's say that it's completely booked. So there are infinite amount of people in this infinite hotel. And then I come there and I want to sleep in Hilbert's hotel. And Hilbert, the receptionist, says, well, no problem. I will simply move the guy in room number 1 to number 2, and then the guy in number 2 to number 3, and so on for infinity. And he does so, and it works, because mathematically there's no problem in adding to infinity. You still get infinity. So if you have infinity plus 1, you still have infinity. So a room will be then ready to use for me. Now, that wouldn't happen in the actual world because you would reach a problem. You would reach an end where you can't actually move someone to another room. You could also say that at this hotel, an infinite amount of people are in an infinite amount of rooms, and then an infinite amount of Russians come and want to sleep at the hotel. And then what Hilbert does is that he takes every person to a room which has the double number compared to the room they were previously in. So the guy in room number 1 goes to 2, and the guy in room number 2 goes to number 4, and so on. And then he will have an infinite amount of empty rooms where he can put the infinite amount of Russians. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. Yeah. So basically, what this tries to show is that the universe must have a starting point. It's impossible for the universe to have existed for eternity because of it being a temporal entity, because time being here. God is a different thing. If God is a timeless being outside of time, he can exist for eternity. But a universe where stuff is happening, you won't have that. So basically, this leads to the conclusion that the universe has a cause, and then, as I said previously, that cause seems to be God, and it's very hard to argue that it would be otherwise. Now, before we go to questions, let me present yet another argument, which is slightly more complicated, because I assume you found this very, very easy. So this is, I call it the argument from necessity. All right? And it's quite similar to the Kalam argument, but it doesn't really deal with the origin of the universe. It would actually work even if you could show that the universe was eternal. You don't have to leap into that discussion for this. And it talks about how things need an explanation, either in and of themselves or in some kind of external explanation. So a guy who has developed this is a Christian philosopher called Leibniz, and he asked the question, which many have asked before him, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there a universe in the first place? Because you could, easily imagine a reality where nothing exists. And in fact, that would be quite an easy reality for an atheist to explain, because there is nothing to explain. But the universe exists, and the universe is what philosophers call contingent, which means it's not necessary. The universe and everything that's in it could easily have not existed. And it's true for me as well. There could be a possible world where I wasn't born, and so I'm not a necessary being. I am contingent. I am dependent on other things for my existence, such as my parents. All right. So this argument says that every contingent fact has an explanation. All right. And furthermore, the universe is a contingent fact, and therefore universe has an explanation. All right? And furthermore, after that, this explanation needs to be necessary. And 5, that necessary being is God. All right, so let me explain this end part here. If you would say that the explanation for the existence of the universe is something similar to the universe, for example, a multiverse or other universes that brought this universe into being, you would have exactly the same problem, because those things would not be necessary either. You could easily imagine them failing to exist. But God is different, because if God exists, then he necessarily exists as a perfect being. Existence wouldn't be something that God could fail at as an all-powerful being. So God is in a different category. And so some would say also that, for example, numbers are necessary things, because you can't really imagine, the number 5 popping out of existence. So these abstract objects probably exist necessarily, and the same is true for God. So that's really the difference between a universe that has, potentially existed forever, and God that has existed forever. That the universe is still contingent, is still dependent on something else. It needs an explanation. So those are the two cosmological arguments. The first one talking about the origin of the universe, and the second one just merely stating that, yeah, the universe exists and that needs an explanation. Anyway, we're going to talk about design arguments for the existence of God, 2 of them specifically. And when talking about design, it's really when there is a purpose behind an object or phenomenon. So it's not just randomly put into existence, but there's actually a thought behind it. And a thought is usually being thinked by intelligent beings. So obviously the Christian message is that the universe, everything that exists, is created and therefore designed by God. And there's a scripture that points to how we, just by observing the things around us, might know that God exists and that God is powerful, that he is able to bring all of the stars and planets and animals and plants into being, right? For example, in Psalm 19, and the Bible says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they display knowledge." And there are indeed a lot of people who have just looked at creation and realized that there is a God. One of my favorite authors, called John Wimber, an American, and he realized that God exists when he went out into the American desert and sat down and watched the sunrise. And then he realized that there is a God. Yeah. So yeah, and basically there's obviously been a lot of debate during the last, I would say, 100 years concerning the origin of life. And there's been a debate about whether it's evolution or if God created all the animals as they are. And I'm not going to dig into that debate, because I think that there are good arguments for the universe and the earth being designed by God, even if you accept evolution, which actually a lot of Christians do. So yeah, I will basically argue that there is a purpose behind what we see around us, both on the macro and micro level. The macro being, the ground scale, all of space. And micro, then we'll look at something very, very small, namely DNA. But let's start with the macro one, all right? And then I'll talk about the fine tuning of the universe and a little planet to illustrate that. All right. So basically, what scientists have found is obviously, and this is not something that just scientists have found, that the universe is very complex. It's very, very complicated. There are a lot of things going on. But not only that, you can change the laws of nature and realize that life wouldn't be able to exist anyway. And this is something that has confused a lot of scientists during just the last 50 years, when they have discovered that, for example, if you change gravity, so you make gravity a little bit stronger or a little bit more lighter in all of the universe, then actually life wouldn't exist anywhere. So not only would life be impossible here on Earth, but life wouldn't be possible anywhere. And this is to a very, very little degree. So basically, if you take 1 and divide it with a number which is 1 and then 60 zeros after it, and you apply that to the laws of nature, then life wouldn't exist anywhere. And there are also other kinds of these constants, as physicists call them. One, for example, called the Cosmological Constant. If you change that by a number which is basically a 1 with 120 zeros after it, then life wouldn't exist anywhere in the universe, and there wouldn't even be stars to begin with. Now, that is a massive number. For comparison, if you take the number of atoms in the universe, you have a number which is 1 and then 80 zeros after it. So basically what we're talking about is this incredible fine-tuning of the universe. Now, this is a problem for those who say that there is no God, because they have to say that there's no purpose behind the universe, there's no design, there's no thought, it just, came into being randomly, and it has evolved randomly, and, it's just molecules bumping into each other without any plan. They can't really explain this fine-tuning, because it's not that these constants are necessary. You could easily imagine a universe that was different, but if you say that it's just because of chance, it's just because of this, this happened randomly, then you realize that the probability of that being the case is so extremely small that it's basically ridiculous. It's a greater possibility that you shoot a little laser up in the night sky and then it goes through the universe for years and years and years and hit a little alien ant on another planet. It's this incredible unlikeliness. And that really points to the fact that it's very reasonable to say that the universe is created and that God is behind it. All right? The second example is a micro example about DNA and the origin of life. Now, DNA is fascinating. I'm sure you've all heard of it. These strings inside all cells that basically map, how we are to function. And there's a lot of them. So in 1 gram of DNA, there is approximately 700 terabytes of information. And that's a lot. My computer has 1 terabyte storage capacity. So, yeah, that's... yeah. And obviously a human body, it weighs more than 1 gram. So, scientists predict that in a normal human body, there's about 150 trillion gigabytes of information in all of the DNA, which is very, very much, all right? So we have this incredible complexity. And again, most atheists will say, well, it just evolved. Evolutions, you have these more simpler species, and then they get children, and eventually you'll end up with a human being who's more complex. The problem is, though, even if you look at the very, very most basic life forms, the most simple bacteria or cell you can find, it's still very complex. So basically, DNA is complicated, and for that to, for that to originate randomly, also is this incredible coincidence. if that's the case. And the probability of that is so small that it's much more probable to say, no, actually, God created life, and God created the information that's in our DNA. There was an atheist in this country called Anthony Flew. Has anyone heard of him?
Yeah, philosopher.
Yeah, he was a philosopher. And he was an atheist most of his life. But then, in 2004, in an interview, he actually said, well, I've looked at the evidence, and I think that there is intelligence behind the universe. There is an intelligent cause for life, right?
Wow.
And later on, 3 years later, he published a book called There Is a God, where he described how he changed his position. And his main argument for this was DNA and it being so complex that he couldn't imagine that this is just due to chance. Wherever we find something as complex and fine-tuned, we usually say that it's it has been brought forth with a thought behind it. So, for example, say that you're walking in the jungle somewhere in the Amazon, and then you find a big city, right? So there's a lot of houses, and there's writing on the houses, and there's different forms of houses used for different functions. Some are storage houses, some are houses that are suitable for living in, and so on. You would assume that these are the artifacts of an ancient civilization, that people have actually lived in this city and constructed that city. But that doesn't have to be the case. I mean, logically, it's possible that these were just some mountains once, and then there were a couple of earthquakes and some rain, and then it randomly constructed this city. But the probability of there being an intelligence and a design behind this city is much more likely, right? And I think, didn't I tell somebody about, I think I told you about the British Railways example in Wales. I think I did, because you come from Wales. Yeah. Yeah. No worries.
So sorry, it's not that you're boring me at all. Do you know what it is? I'm just so relaxed here.
Yeah. No problem at all.
I am listening to you.
Yeah.
But not, it's like when my other half always says to me, like about turning the telly off, like, because you're not watching it. Like, I'm listening to it.
It's all right. You just carry on feeling relaxed.
Yeah.
If you want to sleep, I do feel relaxed. That's not
Yeah.
a good sign, isn't it? I do feel relaxed here. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I do apologise. I'm not falling asleep.
No. It's perfectly fine.
Just look at the back of my eye.
Yeah. It's great. Now, imagine that you're traveling with a train to Wales, all right? And there's a hill outside the window where there are a couple of rocks, and they say British Railways welcomes you to Wales, all right? So then most of you would assume that there have been a couple of employees of British Railways that have put a bunch of rocks on that hill, because they know that people would go with British Railways and the trains to Wales, and they will see that and they will be happy. But that doesn't have to be the case. I mean, it could be the case that these rocks randomly just fell there over a couple of 100,000 of years. And then, randomly they were put in this, sequence, which for us looks like a message in English. That's possible, but it is improbable. It's much more probable that there is design behind these. And furthermore, it's not really possible to speak about information or a message if the fact is that these rocks have just randomly been put there. Because, a message needs, a source. and if there wasn't anyone behind this, then there is no message there. It's just a coincidence. It just appears to be a message, even though it's not. It's only possible to speak about message or this kind of information when there is design behind it. So there's also a famous example by actually an atheist who is called Fred Hoyle. He was an atheist who believed that that life couldn't have spontaneously come up on Earth, but since he didn't have God to refer to, he said that life probably came from outer space. So we're all aliens, and somehow there was life that came here, and he didn't attempt answering where that life came from, but he said that it is so unlikely that life just originates from natural processes. He said that the likelihood of that being 1 divided by a 1 with 40,000 zeros, which is insanely unlikely. And he compared it to, if you imagine a junkyard, so you have a bunch of scraps and metallics and garbage, and then comes a tornado, whew, goes over that junkyard, and when the tornado has left, there's an airplane there, fully functional, with gasoline in its tank. He said that's the likeliness of life just popping into being, and that's why it's actually very reasonable to say that there is a God. So when people say to me, there's no evidence for God's existence, then this is one of the arguments I use. And sometimes I talk about my phone, and I say, when you see this phone, do you think it was manufactured and there was a plan behind it? Or do you think that I just found it in the forest and it was, the effect or the product of millions of years of random metals being mushed together in a volcano? And obviously most of them will say no, it's actually manufactured in China, right? Also when people say that there's no purpose with anything, there's no plan, where we're just here and there's no reason behind it, this is actually very encouraging. This is an example of when science actually really shows the way to God, which made even an atheist willing in the end of his life to say, no, there is an intelligent cause behind the universe. So we're going to cover 2 arguments for God's existence today, quite philosophical in nature, but you're smart guys, so you'll catch up. The moral argument and an argument for reason called the Evolutionary Argument against Naturalism, which is complicated. The moral argument is quite straightforward, so we'll start with that, and we've even covered that before, so I won't go into very much detail. I will sort of go through it quite quickly, and then we'll stop to the second argument. Basically, morality is about what is good and evil, what is right and wrong. Is it right to torture a child for fun, or is it wrong? That's what morality is about. And the question is, if morality is real, also known as objective. And I've actually started to prefer saying real morality, because sometimes people don't get what objective morality is about. Basically, if morality is real, if moral values are facts, it's a fact that it is evil to torture a child for fun, then it's actually exists, it's real. And the same thing with duties. If we have a moral duty not to torture a child for fun, then it actually is a moral fact. Okay. So the argument goes like this: if real moral values and duties exist, then God exists. And the second premise, real moral values and duties do exist, and therefore God exists. So it's quite straightforward. And this is a logical argument. If both of these premises are true, then the conclusion that God exists has to be true. It's logically necessary that it's true. So how do we know that this first premise is true? Well, it's quite obvious, I think, that if God didn't exist, if atheism is true, then there's no reason to believe A, that there are these moral facts floating around somewhere in another realm, and B, that they would sort of connect to the moral understanding of evolved apes on planet Earth, because that's all that we are on atheism. So, we might explain how we came to our moral beliefs in human right and liberty and dignity and all that through socio-biological evolution, basically through pointing out that, well, it's beneficial for our species to say that we should care for each other, or that English society developed these ideas to promote welfare and the British Empire and what have you. You can have all these explanations without claiming that they're actually true and that they're actually a fact that I, as a human being raised in the 21st century who have certain opinions about slavery or prostitution or war, etc., that those beliefs are actually right. Because if they're right, then I'm talking about real moral values. And if others are to behave in that way, then they have a real moral duty. And on atheism, that can't really exist. Because again, there's no reason for why such moral facts should exist in an ideal world somewhere, non-connected to the natural world, but also how, we even could grasp and, take hold of such an ideal world. It doesn't make any sense on atheism. And as I've listened to debates between atheists and Christians on this argument, atheists generally are very divided concerning this. Quite a lot of atheists will say that, well, there are no evidence for objective moral values. There are no evidence that these moral ideas that we have are real, that they are facts. And so they will simply deny that. While other atheists, realizing that this means that you cannot say that Hitler was wrong, you cannot say that someone who rapes and tortures a child is doing something wrong, you realize that this totally goes against our moral experience. And that leads us to the second premise: real moral values and duties exist. You see, when we say that someone who is doing something that we think is totally horrendous and evil, we actually say that there is this realm of moral facts which that person should obey. Because if that wasn't the case, then me pointing out, oh, it's so horrible that you raped that little child, is like me saying, oh, it's so horrible that you like chocolate ice cream. But there's no moral duty for anyone else to eat chocolate ice cream just because I think that way. So the moment we say that that's wrong, or that's evil, or that's good and that's right, and this is what we ought to do, this is what we ought not to do, then we're actually confessing that real moral values and duties exist. Now, couldn't that be just an illusion that we have? That's basically what the atheist has to argue, that this is just an illusion of the human mind, that there aren't really moral values and duties out there. It's just something we come up with to sort of cope in the world. But again, nobody really believes this. Because the moment when we make moral judgments and either promote or prohibit moral ideas and actions, then we actually confess that these are real things. They're not just illusions of the human mind. And I think this is more than just hypocrisy on the atheist part. First saying that there are no moral values and then trying to act morally and, condemning others who act immorally. It's more than hypocrisy. Basically, when an atheist says that there are no moral values and duties that are real, then the atheist is actually saying that we should believe something that we don't believe, including the atheist, him or herself. And that's why I think this is actually one of the most powerful arguments for God's existence, because I think that both premises are evidently true. Atheism has no explanation whatsoever that real moral values and duties should exist, but yet all of us know that they do exist, and therefore we can know that God exists. Now, another reason for why atheism cannot explain why real morality should exist is because the logical outcome of atheism, as is generally believed here in the West and in Europe, is that everything is sort of determined by the laws of nature and the processes of nature. All the atoms and particles bumping into each other is sort of a domino effect from the start of the Big Bang, and that's determined. You can't change that because there's no supernatural intervention in the world, according to the atheists, and so everything just happens, and all the way that we behave are just a consequence of the input that we get. And then you can't really have morality. There's a podcast called Apologetics Canada, which is a podcast from Canada doing apologetics. They have a guy called Steve Kim, and he described it like this. Suppose that you have two domino bricks, and you can choose by either putting or petting, no, pointing, what? Patting. You can pat the left on the right, boom, or the right on the left, right? That's your two options. Which option is evil? Neither. Right, Heather. So it doesn't matter. Now you can increase these to 1 million domino bricks, and it's still not good or evil, you know, which way they go or in what order all these domino bricks are put. You could increase this to 1 Google, which is a 1 followed by 100 zeros, domino bricks, and still there's no morality here. And when you think about it, the number of atoms in the observable universe is less than a Google, then you realize that there could not really be any real morality on an atheist worldview. Now, for that very same reason, atheism cannot really explain why reason exists. And so by reason I mean our thinking, and especially, you know, the way we try to think logically to form coherent thought that don't contradict each other and doesn't make any sense. What we're basically trying to do on these Q&As. And this is actually a real problem for atheism. Because again, if everything is just determined by all the physical things that exist in the universe that bump into each other in a very long chain of events, then there is no choice, there's no free will on an atheist worldview. And there are indeed many atheists who say, no, there's no free will. We don't choose, we have an illusion of choosing, but whatever choice we make is just the circumstances of our environment and, you know, what we learned and how we were brought up. It's not really that we have an agency, we're just machines, biological machines, computers who just do whatever we're told by our environments. And so it's quite common that you encounter atheists who think like this, like Richard Dawkins, for example. But then it's not really possible to talk about rationality or choosing to do something reasonable, to say that, for example, atheism is reasonable, so I choose to believe in atheism. Well, on atheism you don't. And you can't really criticize a Christian for being Christian, because there's no real rationality here. There's no choice involved for doing something rational. And then when we step to the evolutionary argument against naturalism, this is formulated by a Christian philosopher called Alvin Plantinga, who resides in the United States. And he points out that evolution actually speaks against atheism, which is not something that you hear very commonly. But he thinks that's the case, and I think he has a very good argument for it. So say that you both believe in evolution and naturalism. Naturalism is this idea that nature is the only thing that exists. So there's no supernatural realm, there is no God, there are no angels, no spirits, and everything that happens in the universe is just caused by these natural laws and natural processes. There are no miracles and so on. Quite a common belief nowadays. Now, here Alvin Plantinga says, if you believe that both evolution and naturalism is true, then you would expect that the cognitive faculties in our brain that produces our beliefs are not reliable. So there's a low reliability of our thinking. Now, why is that? Well, he points out that evolution just wants survival. So the goal of evolutionary process is to avoid death, right? And evolution by natural selection makes sure that animals that don't die will get babies. and so they are the ones that will go on and give their DNA and give their species more life. So that's what evolution is interested in, so to speak. And if naturalism is true, there is no God guiding evolution. It's just a blind process making sure that species that are adaptable to their surroundings survive. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that what they think is true. So, Alvin Plantinga talks about a little frog. Here's a frog sitting on a leaf. And the frog sees a fly. All right? And so the frog pulls its little tongue out and eats the fly. All right? Now, that's obviously a pattern that will promote the frog's survival. And so whatever this little frog is thinking, it's the thinking that promotes survival that will make sure that this frog lives on and have baby frogs, right? But whatever beliefs the frog has about these flies don't have to be true as long as they promote survival. So either the frog can think, oh, there's a fly there, I should eat that because I need flies to survive, and then they eat it. And that would be a true belief as far as we understand it. But it could also be that the frog thinks that's a dangerous weapon against me and I'm gonna attack it. And so the eating is just a byproduct of this false belief. It could even be that the frog thinks that the fly is over there, even though it's over there. And so it tries to shoot its tongue out to catch the fly, but it really shoots its tongue out that way. So the tongue goes the right way, but the frog was thinking wrong the whole time. Basically, Plantinga's point is that you don't have to have true beliefs just to survive. You can equally have false beliefs if they promote your survival. But the problem, of course, for the naturalist or atheist is that if we can't rely on our beliefs and we're as much animals as this frog, then we can't, reasonably believe in any of our beliefs, including naturalism. So basically, the combination of believing in evolution and believing in naturalism is that the probability of our reason is low. And it's a very interesting argument. And yeah, I'm guessing that you have a lot of questions concerning both of these, so we'll go to the Q&A session. So we're going through the cosmological argument for God's existence, and these are both miracles.
Cosmological
Yeah, that's the argument from the universe. We'll be going through the design argument and also the argument from moral. Those have been the three previous Q&As that we've had.
Yes.
Yeah. And now we're going to dig into the miraculous argument for God's existence, the argument from miracles, which is something that I personally really like. I've actually started writing a book on my own about this argument, and yeah, I've been very interested in the existence of miracles ever since I became a Christian, really. And I'm sure you were you present on the gospel meeting yesterday in the evening? No, well, Ralph was, and I talked about that then. So basically, what I'm arguing is if miracles, I hope I pronounced that correctly, are possible, then miracles most certainly happen, and from that we can know that God most certainly exists. That's basically my argument. So starting with the first one, I think this is quite evident. There's not really any positive argument for atheism, any positive argument for that God wouldn't exist. What atheists usually do is they criticize religion. They might criticize different arguments that we give for the existence of God, but it's not really any plausible argument for why it would be impossible for God to exist. And so many atheists, include Richard Dawkins, would not go as far as claiming that they know that God doesn't exist. Many believe that it doesn't exist. Many think that they don't see any reason for why they should believe that he exists. But it's very few that would go as far as saying that the existence of God is impossible. And if you can't exclude the existence of God, you can't exclude the existence of miracles, because miracles are really acts of God. And there have been attempts, for example, by an 18th century philosopher called David Hume, who lived here in the UK. He tried to show that we shall not believe in miracle reports. And his argument for that was that the laws of nature are established by universal human experience, and miracles break the laws of nature, and so we have all of human experience speaking for these laws of nature, and when a miracle comes and interrupt that, there's really no reason to believe that a miracle really has happened. It's more probable, David Hume said, that either the person sharing the story is lying or has been deceived or something like that. But the problem with that is that miracles, or both miracle experience and belief in miracles, are a part of universal human experience, or at least the majority of human experience. This book by Craig Keener about miracles states that in 10 countries, including United States, China, India, Nigeria, and some others, about 200 million Pentecostal and charismatic Christians claim to have experienced miracles. That's not a proof that all of them have indeed experienced miracles, but it shows that in just these 10 countries there are 200 million people that claim to have experienced miracles, and then you're only looking at Pentecostal and charismatic Christians, who are not even all Christians in those countries. And that really shows that it's wrong to say that universal human experience would exclude miracles. In fact, David Hume has been criticized by many for doing a circle reasoning. He starts with assuming that miracles don't happen. He starts with naturalism, the idea that nature is the only thing that exists, that supernature doesn't exist. And then of course he arrives at the conclusion that you should never believe a miracle report. But if you don't start with that assumption, then there's actually no reason to say that a miracle, if well supported, would be less probable than a natural cause to a phenomenon. So because of this, it's not really plausible to say that miracles are impossible. Even though many seem to believe this, and many seem to want to find a natural explanation to everything that happens, there are in fact a lot of things happening in the world that can't be explained by natural explanations. And so, since there's no argument for why God's existence or miracles would be impossible, we should be open to the possibility that supernatural phenomena do happen. So basically, no reason to assume naturalism, the idea that nature is the only thing that exists. Well, again, I say that because of this, that miracles are possible, which I think is undoubtedly true. Miracles are most certainly actually happen in the world today. And so again, there are many people who claim to have experienced miracles, and several of these reports have actually scientific support in that they're scientifically inexplicable. So there are a lot of medically verified healings. Craig Keener goes through some of these in his book, but I'd also like to read some from a book that I've written. It's not published yet. It's called Charismactivism. It will hopefully be published next spring. But yeah, I go through some medically verified healing. For example, there was a healing evangelist in the US called Catherine Kuhlman, who's quite famous. And she welcomed medical verification for those who claim to be healed at her meetings. And one doctor who was convinced that this is actually something supernatural going on was called Richard Overland. He was a cancer researcher. And his baby had a dislocated hip. And this daughter was just 4 months old. And after she received prayer, her legs straightened. And this doctor...
Catherine Kuhlman?
Yeah, that was at a Catherine Kuhlman meeting. And of course he realized that this can't be psychosomatic. This baby isn't really aware of something going on. So it's not that, a placebo effect, that this baby just is convinced that something will happen. Rather, he was convinced that this is something miraculous going on. And so he started to support Kuhlman's ministry. There's a doctor called Richard Kastorf, who's written a book called The Miracles. He writes about 10 medically verified healings. One of them of a woman called Anne Saltz. So she started to have serious problems with speaking, hearing, and remembering. And it was discovered that she had a growing brain tumor. But after she was prayed for, she was scanned again, and the brain tumor was completely gone. And the doctors had no explanation for that. In fact, there's a whole network called the World Christian Doctors Network, which is based in South Korea, that gathers Christian doctors from all around the world, and many of them testify about medically verified healings. One of them is called Jun Song Kim, and he has reported several healings from blindness or partial blindness, or other kinds of visual healings. So one guy called J.W. Ham, he had nearsightedness, and he had that for 16 years. And after prayer in 2011, his eyesight was recovered. So it went from 0.3 on the left eye and 0.5 to 0.9 and 1.0 so basically was completely restored. And there are many other cases from them. Even the Catholic Church have a system of when they want to canonize a saint, there must be 2 medically verified healings to confirm the sanctification of that person. So medically verified healings happen. Or at least, if we should express ourselves more modest, scientifically inexplicable cures happen. Of course, science can't really tell whether there's a supernatural cause to this, because science doesn't deal with supernature. Science only deals with nature, and what science can conclude is that there is no natural explanation to these events as far as we know. Now, a typical atheist response to the existence of this phenomena is that these probably have a natural explanation that we don't know about. So it might very well be that these people who are healed in ways that science can't explain today might have an explanation tomorrow. We can't know that. And I would say that that is not a very strong explanation, since it's unknown. And so if you compare the supernatural explanation, that's very known. It's been given for thousands of years, whereas the natural explanation is unknown. Now, there are some cures that were inexplicable in the past that's now being explained by contemporary science. But such progress historically doesn't guarantee that science will be able to explain all of these cures, especially not the weird coincidences of these cures being connected to prayer. Some of them are actually quite instant after prayer, and so the pain or ailment disappears immediately, and then when they go back to check up with the doctor, they're healed. And it is a problem that for this unknown natural explanation that has always been unknown in these cases. To take an example, in Kenya, there is a woman called Teresa Jebiwot who was cured from...
How can you remember that?
Well, I've been reading. Yeah. Now, she was born blind, and she went to a meeting with a preacher called David Awur, and she was healed, so she could see after that meeting. And she had been going to a school for the blind. She went to a doctor called Agnes Mayo, who examined her and found that she now had restored eyesight, and you could physically or visually see the difference in her eyes. Now, this is similar to something we read in the Bible when Jesus heals a man who was born blind in John 9. So you have this parallel, and of course many atheists will say that, well, in the Bible case it's just a myth, it's just invented. But you can't say the same with this contemporary Kenyan example. Oh yeah, I agree with you. But that's a typical atheist response when it comes to miracles. So what we have is really this phenomenon, and there are many more examples throughout history about this. And to this very day, the unknown natural explanation to a person born blind suddenly seeing again is very unknown. And I think this strongly supports that the supernatural explanation is plausible. Because it's basically saying that it would be more probable with this unknown explanation rather than an explanation that be given for thousands of years. It's basically like saying that, well, there's probably another explanation for, the day being bright and warm than the sun warming us up and shining. Because then you're, referring to an unknown explanation which really has no precedent historically compared to a known explanation which many people think seem plausible. So this basically an argument for the existence of miracles. I call that the explanatory argument. There's another one which I call the probability argument for miracles, which doesn't necessarily rely on these medically verified healings, even though they can be supported by that as well. This is a book by Dr. David Lewis, who's a UK anthropologist, or English, I guess, and it's called Healing Fiction, Fantasy or Fact. He's writing about some charismatic meetings that he attended with John Wimber from the Vineyard Church. And he writes about words of knowledge that were given there about people that they were going to pray for. So John Wimber said the following: there's a woman named Janet who at 11 years of age had a minor accident that's proven to be a problem throughout her adult life. It has something to do with an injury to her tailbone, but now it's caused other kinds of problem, and so there's radiating pain that comes down over her lower back and down her backside and down her legs. It has something to do with damage to a nerve, but it's also to do with some sort of functional problem with the, I think it's called the sacroiliac. That's his literal words. Now, Dr. Lewis goes through the list of information that's provided here by Wimber and calculates that if he just either by some form of natural inspiration or just by chance randomly says things about this woman and there's no supernatural factor involved, the likelihood of a woman with that condition being present at the conference is 1 to 3 million, which is very, very small. And she was indeed present at the conference. She went forward for prayer and she was healed from this, which also is very improbable, because even if you would give the exact details of this woman and her conditions, there's no guarantee that she will experience a cure from that after prayer, but she did. And David Lewis goes through several examples like this. Now, when the natural explanation that this is just chance, this is just coincidence, is so insignificantly improbable, since we cannot exclude the existence of miracles, since we cannot exclude supernature as a part of reality, that becomes actually very probable. So again, miracles most certainly happen as we observe these things and realize that naturalism has a huge problem in explaining these things, because there are many, many examples of cures and other things happening in response to prayer that are very improbable if supernature doesn't exist, but very, very probable if supernature does exist. I mean, if God exists, then there's nothing illogical with him answering prayer. So that's why I would say that miracles most certainly happen. But some atheists will then say, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that God exists. What if there are some other supernatural being doing this? What if it's the devil that's doing this, right? Many will point to the existence of miracles in other religions. Miracles in other religions as a counter-argument to this, and say, well, if the Christian God is a true God, why do Hindus claim to experience miracles, or Buddhist or New Ages, and so on. And when the Christian responds, well, that's probably false spirits and demons trying to deceive people, then the atheist typically responds, well, what if you're deceived by the demons and the Muslims have the true God, or the Hindu, right? But I think the atheist misses the point when this objection is raised. Because when pointing out similar supernatural phenomena with equal support, or at least close to equal support, when it comes to verification, when it comes to improbability, and so on, they're not really arguing for atheism then. They're just decreasing the probability of atheism being true, because you can't prove atheism and naturalism by pointing out that there are miracles around the world. And basically, all the arguments that I've been going through the last 4 weeks are really arguments against atheism. They're not specifically pointing out the Christian God. The first argument about the origin of the universe, it was just arguing that there must be a transcendent cause to the universe, a God that creates the universe. But that could be the Muslim God, that could be some other God. Arguments for Christianity will come the next 2 weeks because they deal more with Jesus and the Bible and so on. So basically, it's not really an argument for atheism to point out miracles in other religions. That being said, I think there are good reasons to believe that the miracles in the Christian tradition are more well supported and stronger in power, and also they seem to be more connected with peace and benevolence compared to what you usually find in paganism or different animistic religions. I've been to South Africa and I've seen the Sangoma religion, and it's quite different. The supernatural things that happen there are usually connected with curses and things like that. But then I would also say that no matter what the source is to a particular miracle, they do suggest that a God exists. Because if you think about it theoretically, if some kind of supernatural being, whether it's a god or an angel or a demon or something else, responds to prayer, that means that a supernatural reality exists. And that supernatural reality needs to be explained. So you either need to have spiritual agents that's been around forever, that makes them basically gods, or if they haven't been around forever, they must have a cause. They must have been created. And so no matter what you choose, you will end up with God or multiple gods. But the idea of multiple gods or polytheism is problematic in itself because they would rule out each other. I think it's very reasonable to say that if a supernatural reality exists, then a God who is responsible for that supernatural reality must exist as well. So that's basically the miraculous arguments that supernatural reality means that God